Well, we're actually starting right now, but I guess it will take folks to find the way here. Did I read the schedule correctly?
Yeah.
Good. I did, but did it change?
I'm just teasing you because you're pulling on a piece of paper.
Old-fashioned guy. John, did you send me some slides?
No.
No. You don't? Or you? It's okay. If you don't, I can throw up.
Yeah, I don't know.
Everyone else has slides. Yeah. Here, you want to see? Okay, let's get started. Good. Screen doesn't work. Start.
They finished just to the end of the year.
Okay.
They did. This is the. I mean, somebody would give me an exercise to do a toast in here. It's not me. I'm getting an exercise.
I wasn't the only.
Thomas gets more than that. Oh, you know what? They figured Thomas was a chair.
And they thought.
Deal because he went 68 miles.
So they sent me over here.
Not exaggerating.
So here's the agenda for today. Mike is going to speak about the discovery metadata, and that goes first. We'll talk about the mix-up mitigation, and Andre prepared some material, and we've John talking about that as well. We also have then the encoding claims in an Oauth state parameter using a JWT. We don't have slides on that, but it's we can put the document on the screen. And then we have the token binding proof of possession discussion as well. So let's start with the first one with the metadata. I think that's probably the simplest one. I've uploaded the slides already, so you should be able to see them there.
Where's the pink box?
The blue box.
Where's the microphone?
Here.
That would be that. I'm Mike Jones. I'm a standards architect at Microsoft, and I've worked on some Oauth drafts. I'll be here to talk, to start a discussion based on a draft that went through working group last call, but there'll be an expanded discussion based on trying to resolve some continuing feedback from some people with use cases that I want to talk about next. So, document status. The current draft is 03. In the course of the lifetime of the document, you all probably remember that we actually removed all the stuff about discovery and left only the metadata, which is the result of discovering information about an authorization server. And then the format of the data structure was based on a bunch of existing practice. So I was trying to, and my co-authors were trying to just standardize what was already being done. Some in the working group considered the spec complete for their use cases, which was true. Phil Hunt, among others, who I'm sorry couldn't be here this time.
But he's online.
Hi, Phil. Had been asking us to also work on use cases where the flows start at the resource server rather than at the authorization server or the client. And, you know, we've all readily admitted that the OAuth metadata isn't complete for those use cases. Currently, interestingly, we have metadata documents for clients, for dynamic client registration, and the working group draft for authorization servers, but not for resource servers. And in fact, as I was working on another OAuth document, which we'll talk about later on, I realized, you know, oh, I could have maybe used this third kind of metadata anyway. So, next slide. So, rather than trying to just push through the one document as it exists, it's probably a more general solution to instead fill the gap identified also by defining resource server metadata formats. And Phil and I, with some others kibitzing in the background, had agreed to work on this together. I'm about 80% done with this on the plane, but I wasn't going to post something that Phil and some others haven't reviewed. So close to having an initial draft on that next. But I can give you an outline of what's in it, and it should be completely unsurprising. It's a JSON document where the format is exactly parallel to the other metadata formats. It contains a URI that self-identifies the resource for integrity purposes, something I talked with Tony about before, and as the other documents do. The thing that Phil was happy about is you could have a value that lists the authorization servers that you could use. And so for use cases, which is not all use cases, where that set is enumerable, you could enumerate them and then know that from this resource, it's safe to go any of these places. Other methods, you can say what kind of bearer methods it's supported. You can list what scopes can be used with the resource. You can provide human readable documentation, human readable privacy policy, human readable terms of service, again, all parallel to metadata in the other documents. And also parallel, there's a well-known location where it lives, which is well-known OAuth resource server as opposed to well-known OAuth authorization server. This should be non-surprising, Dick. Let's share, Dick.
Dick Hart. I just want to clarify. So my understanding of .well known is it's only at the host root.
Good question. Well known has been used by OpenID Connect and some other use cases to where you tack it onto a resource URI. So if, for instance, your issuer is a path, you tack it on there. And this would be the same case that if your resource includes a path component, you would append /.wellknown/OAuth resource server to that path. That's what gives you the circular reference, giving you integrity of tying the resource server to its metadata? So good question. Next. Other things have come up in the discussions since we last convened in Buenos Aires, and in fact, really since we last talked about this on the list. Some use cases have come up, including federation establishment and maintenance, where you would like the metadata document to be signed, not just flat JSON. Leif had talked about this with me 2 years ago. Roland Hedberg is needing it for the different types. And in fact, the Oauth working group already did this for one of our document metadata formats, which is we defined this thing called a software statement in the client metadata, which again should be familiar to all of you, but it's just exactly the same values, but in a signed JOT or encrypted JOT, rather than just being flat JSON. And if both values are provided, the ones in the JOT take precedence. That's the pattern that I would propose that we apply to all three metadata formats.
Thorsten Lorstedt, just one question. Can you please explain the use case for assigned metadata? Because I think software statement, or you kind of directly compare software statements and this kind of metadata, because this kind of metadata is provided via a TLS protected server authenticated channel, whereas the software statement, in a software statement, the signature is created by an entity which is not present in the actual process. So can you please explain? You want? Okay.
John Bradley. So it would be a bit like a software statement. These would be third-party attested attributes about the identity provider, i.e. they conform to European privacy law. They're allowed to ask for the, they can provide these sorts of claims. So if a third party, such as if you were a school and you belong to a federation, etc., they may say that you're part of, meet some entity category, which would be what it would be called in SAML.
Yeah, that's fine, and that's one use. But there are other reasons why you want to not to tie the authentication of the content of the object to the authentication of the transport where you happen to find it, right? I mean, caching is one thing, right? If you have very, very large sets of metadata, you definitely don't want to distribute them from, you may want to distribute them from a CDN, for instance, right? And you don't necessarily want to give the CDN the key that you use to authenticate your original metadata distribution endpoint, right? So you sign the object and have the CDN pick it up, right? Yeah, exactly. Well, not only of the transport, but you don't necessarily want to tie the authentication of the data, the authentication of the transport.
Some people are even more paranoid and don't trust TLS. So there's two sorts of issues. One, can you sign the whole thing versus can you also have subsets of the thing which are signed by third parties that attest to particular attributes?
Okay, Thorsten, again. Then I would like to ask why this should go in this specification. I mean, if there is a need to have other ways to distribute metadata, then this could potentially go to a different RFC.
Let's see. We've already set the precedent of defining a metadata value in the client metadata by which you provide this. And I think having parallel values in both the authorization server metadata and the resource server metadata documents makes good sense. That way you can know when looking at the document that, oh, there's additional metadata which is signed here.
Phil wants to say something. Do I, if I hit the button, do I let him speak, or how does it work?
If you hit the button, he has to drink another beer at 6 o'clock.
Phil, you can say something. Phil, go ahead.
No, we hit the red button once. We haven't hit it.
I hit it already. Okay.
There, okay.
Perfect. Okay. Now you can speak.
Speak, Phil.
It sounds like the statement method was actually a new use case, that it's discovery via a third party as opposed to discovery at the resource or discovery at the AS. Does that make sense?
No, it would still be this is John. It would still be discovery at the AS, but the discovery at the AS would contain individual assertions which are attested to by a third party. So it's not discovery at the third party, though. Some of Leif's use cases, if you sign the whole thing, it might be distributed out of band.
Okay, Thorsten again. Then, based on what I've learned in this discussion, please clearly document the use cases in the RFC. Thanks.
Thank you. Next.
Is that okay, William?
Come share the microphone.
What? Okay.
Phil, have you had your say?
Next slide.
Yeah, I know.
Next slide.
Phil is going to say something.
Okay.
No, I'm just was trying to get on to say, yes, I'm good.
Thank you.
Cool. Perfect. Thank you.
So the other thing that should be unsurprising that Phil and I and Tony and a few others talked about was, well, if you can reference authorization servers from resources, you want to also be able to reference resources from the authorization server so that you have bidirectional validation, again, in the use cases where these things are enumerable. So this is, once again, a hopefully unsurprising thing that we would propose to do to the existing document. I will add a meta comment that's not in the slides, that a lot of the use cases where the set, for instance, of authorization servers is not enumerable because it can grow over time. Instead, you do the validation of the authorization server by signature schemes, such as, for instance, they're being signed metadata signed by in common or your favorite federation operator. Next. There's a naming question that's gone back and forth on the list, and I figured I would raise it again and try to get a sense of the room, perhaps. For historic reasons, the current document is titled Authorization Server Discovery Metadata. Some have said, well, given you're not discovering anymore, you're just presenting the result of discovery, you could drop discovery from the name. And in fact, the document which Phil and I are writing is currently has a working title of Resource Server Metadata. So we could just drop discovery and have it be Authorization Server Metadata, and then they would be parallel. I think Nat was in favor of that. Do others want to do that? There's some thumbs up in the front of the room. That's not usual IETF procedure, but I'm okay with that.
This is Thorsten. I support that proposal.
Does anybody really want to keep discovery in the name? Nobody speaks up. Okay, we'll do that. Thank you. So this is my last slide. I was just going to ask, shall we proceed in the ways described? It seems to me like we should. Dick is coming.
Dick Hart, wasn't sure there was an answer to Torsten's question about the signing the document. Are we using a standard signing mechanism, or is there?
Sure.
Okay.
And of course, it's for the document that is still work in progress. It's hard to say on like what the we'll have to look at it once we actually see it. But
That's right. But within a small number of days, I'll have updated drafts because these are all very local changes.
Yes.
I just, in particular, didn't want to publish the resource one without my co-author being able to read what I'm putting his name to.
in adding some of the use case descriptions that Thorsten mentioned, that shouldn't take too long either, hopefully. So what is the expected? It seems that so we had some discussions about this. Looked like pretty contentious at the last IETF meeting in Buenos Aires. we had a side conversation as well related to that topic, and it feels that we are on track again. So what is?
I think we are. I mean, speaking personally for a moment, I sort of stepped back from the heated conversations, walked away from it for a little while, and I mentally came back to it. And I thought, okay, I know Phil wants to do something valuable. This document doesn't do it. What's the straightforward way to also do that, rather than just, you know, standing on a podium and saying, well, this is good for my use cases. I'm perfectly willing to work on things for additional use cases. And I think that unblocks us. Thank you.
Brian, do you have some additional remarks?
So as I remember, one of the things I think Phil was concerned about that led to some of the discussions previously was about a resource server sort of using a token, getting an access token delivered to it and turning around and using it at another resource server. It wasn't entirely clear, but that seems to have been a stated concern with things that start at a resource server. And this,
Well, I think, so if I understood, so we had a side discussion, it was a little confusing, but it felt like one of the issues was that, or assumption was, the starting point of where the interaction takes place. And one is obviously getting the metadata from the authorization server and knowing on what he could use it for. And the other one is basically just starting at the other side of the communication with the resource server, and then figuring out on what authorization server can I use this.
okay.
Can I use that resource with?
But
Or that's which resource, which authorization server supports specific resource server?
But if we're looking to constrain the use of the token, just cross-referencing a list of supported authorization servers and a list of supported resource servers doesn't really address the problem, because any of those resource servers.
I agree. If that was the original use case, then it probably doesn't get us that. But Phil is speaking up. Phil, do you want to say something?
So the use case was, as Mike said, when discovery starts at the resource, it really doesn't matter whether it's discovery or authorization server first. The question is, you want to know that you first discovered the discovery from the correct place. And I was looking for a method that, how do I know an attacker hasn't misinformed the client? And I was thinking of, at the time, two different use cases. One is we wanted to do discovery for skim. And then the other case was, what about when we start genericizing email clients and OAuth enabling those? Right now, they're all hard written to Google and Microsoft or whoever's written, and they have to have special connectors. So they'll need discovery as well. And the problem is, if the user was convinced to use a bad website that pretending to be the real one through a phishing attack or something like that, then they start off discovery for, let's say, what they think is Google email, and then their client, then they go and connect to the real Google authorization server. Everything works fine, and what's happening now is the client's now relaying, getting an access token, giving it to the Fisher's proxy server, which then goes to the real OAuth enabled resource server. And what I felt was, a year ago, and Mike mentioned it today, was you need some bidirectional confirmation that the resource server you discovered acknowledges the authorization server, and the authorization server acknowledges that the resource endpoint the client is actually using is valid for its purposes. So last year's counter spec that Tony and I submitted had a request response format where you ask the authorization server, I'm talking to this resource, give me your discovery for the authorization server that works. And that was one way to confirm. So that was controversial. We still have to solve that linking, proving that the linking is valid, because a man in the middle can be TLS valid, the domain name can be valid, it can have a certificate and everything like that. but the fact that it's the wrong one is still a problem.
John Bradley. So as Phil points out, you still have the problem of nefarious resources. So that gives us three options, which are going to have to be addressed in the security considerations. One, having the server discovery point back at the resources which are valid, and having the client not send tokens to resources that the authorization server doesn't know about. Two, talking to the token endpoint and having the access tokens audience restricted to whatever endpoint the client is going to send the token to. Or three, some sort of token binding or other proof of possession mechanism. So we'll just have to lay that out. I think we understand the threat of the nefarious client fairly well. I think over time we will probably move to proof of possession tokens to get around this. If you have a to eliminate nefarious resources' ability to replay tokens at other resources, that's what proof of possession is designed to solve. So that stops you from having to a priori know every endpoint in the network. So you either have to pre-configure everything in discovery files, or you have to use some sort of proof of possession or tight audience restriction. There's really no other magic pixie dust.
Phil here, I'll point out that I'm not sure that one of the ones we're looking at, token binding, would work because it assumes that the initial setup was correct. So it's good for repeating a valid configuration. It wouldn't necessarily solve the case.
It doesn't let the resource replay the token, which is the point.
No, in this case, it would allow the fake resource to establish its own binding.
But let's discuss this when we have the more details about the token binding itself. But I think what I'm hearing is that we obviously need to document also for this document, not just for the authorization server metadata, document the use cases and the expectations, and then we can have a look at the document. We'll discuss it.
This is Brian. One last comment following on John's. I just want to say that in some cases it's going to be nearly impossible to enumerate all the known resources available. And even in the case when you do enumerate them, cross-referencing them, it maybe solves for the case of an unknown nefarious resource, but it elevates all the resources to equal trust. And if one's compromised or one is less trusted, it can attack the others. So it's not in itself a really a sufficient solution, I think, for the sort of cross-resource attack problem.
It's really convenient. Thorsten, I second Brian's statement. I mean, what you at least need is audience restriction on the access tokens to prevent that.
Do we have a scribe?
Yes.
Okay, did the scribe capture John's three attacks?
Mitigations.
The three possible mitigations for nefarious resources are A, back pointers at the authorization server saying what resources are trusted. This is only a medium mitigation because no resources that you think that you trust may sometimes go bad. The other mitigation is audience restriction, i.e. only issuing a token that is good at an individual resource, so that if a resource attempts to replay it at another resource, it will notice that it's for a different audience and reject the token. The third one is to use some sort of proof of possession so that only the client that the token was issued to can present the token and not one resource replaying it against another resource. There is no magic pixie dust other than that, was the fourth one.
Okay.
Right. Thank you, John and William.
Perfect. Okay. So when okay, so we'll see the update, one update on the existing document, a new update, and then we'll see where we are and how long it will take us to finish it. Okay. So next on the agenda is actually the mix-up mitigation document. We should probably let's see how that goes. So we have one presentation. Andre sent me a presentation slide deck. So we had, as said at the Monday meeting, we get together and discuss those mix-up related attacks a little bit. So we did, and Andre prepared the slide deck to guide us through that discussion, through the different approaches. And I would say we give it a try and see how that goes and whether we come up with a way forward for the document.
Hello. So my slides are not exactly about the mix-up mitigations. This is more the outcome of the workshop. And there are 3 outcomes in the workshop. The first is that we might need to have a separate doc, or
I think we don't need to sort of like spend too much time on like the document management thing, but I think it's
just the evaluation thing. Okay, so you can turn to the next slide.
Okay.
And then one slide more.
Okay.
So I think we'll benefit to have some sort of a framework to structure discussions about the mitigations we have, including the mix-up mitigations. We might have compare the existing mitigations by several criteria. For example, I would say that the implementation level provider and versus client is something important. And it wasn't, I think, mentioned exactly. It wasn't mentioned explicitly in the mix-up mitigation draft, but there might be mitigations where only changes are required on the provider side, and there are mitigations which would require both sides, provider and client, to change their behavior. And we might have, if we tried to get to the mitigations which would require only changes on the provider side, for example, no changes on the client, this might save us a lot of time, because we will not able to get all the clients in the same room, for example, but we will be able to gather like major providers here. Also, I think we might compare mitigations by what protections it gives us. So we described lately that there are 2 missing security properties, and the idea is that if the mitigation covers the whole security properties, it might obsolete several mitigations at the same time, or it might be just mitigations for the existing attack. I think the most pragmatic thing we would like to mention is that how complex is the mitigation. For example, the mix-up, the IDP mix-up mitigation, and we might compare things by what is the cost of the deprecation. You can turn to the next slide. So this is a very brief analysis of the mix-up mitigation. I don't think this is. I think it lacks deepness, but I just wanted to show as an example of how we can structure conversations. For example, the mix-up where the mitigations where we include issuer and client ID as a response is something which requires protocol change. This is just, I'm trying to stay neutral, just claiming that this would require changes on the provider and on the client side. I think we all know why this. And if we try to compare what properties it addresses the authentication property, so that the client knows what is a provider. But it doesn't cover the authentication fully. It just covers the attack itself. You can turn to the next slide. This is another mitigations I wanted to propose. Oh, just another mitigation which I wanted to propose, which would also potentially address the mix-up attack. Namely, we can try to mandate post-binding instead of GET requests to the authorization endpoint and the redirection endpoint. We can try to use the post-binding always. As a result, it will give us the origin header in all major browsers, and it will give us an additional browser level way of identifying the caller. So identity provider in our case. So you can see how it might potentially work. It's not It's not the mix-up slide. You can turn to the next.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, sure.
Just one observation on that, John Bradley again. The post response mode and the ability to specify a response mode are part of OpenID Connect, not defined in OAuth. And that may or may not work with all clients. So it would be an understatement to assume that that had no implementation cost on the clients, etc. Because yes, most OpenID Connect clients will be happy to do that, but certainly most OAuth clients will just blow up unless the client's changed.
Justin says this binding doesn't work with native clients, does it? Or how does it even work with web clients?
Microphone.
It works with the web app clients and the native clients, because okay, so origin, I think, is not inserted when the native app issues a request and opens a web browser externally. So I think we don't have enough protections for the native clients here.
Okay. So what I'm missing is we also have the third solution approach, which I'm missing from a slide. I tried to move to the next one because I think that would be important information as well. And the third one is per US AS URIs and the matching. Yeah, redirect URIs.
Oh, so yeah, I'm missing this here right now. So I might prepare a separate analysis if you need that.
Yeah, I think those are the three different for the mix-up document. So ideally, I would like to walk out of the room with an idea on how we move forward with the document. Since we had discussed these three techniques, this one is newer. We discussed this at the workshop last week. The first one is this one is what is currently written up, and I don't know when we came up with the redirect URI matching per, but I think that was originally, yeah. But we somehow rejected it. Don't remember why.
We initially rejected it because it requires server changes. Because OAuth does not require exact redirect URI matching with the code flow, so it would be.
So let's write this down as well.
So
in the same.
I'm not saying that I'm in no way saying that exact redirect URI matching is a bad thing. Always recommended it, but it is a breaking change for some servers. Yeah. So.
William Dennis. Yeah, I'm just pointing out that both require server changes, and actually the yeah.
Torsten speaking. Who was next? You wanted to say something? I think the point I also made yesterday and on last Friday is we didn't have a real comprehensive discussion of all those options and their properties. So we should have that discussion.
Right, we're having it right now.
Yeah, we are having it right now, and we just discarded, or someone decided to discard the redirect URI stuff.
No. He can say his opinion, whatever it is.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. My proposal is to add all those options to the discussion, and then have a discussion of the pros and cons, and decide as a working group what's the best way forward.
I didn't just throw that away now. I said I was referring to why in Darmstadt we didn't rate that as a high solution. So I'm not sure that no protocol changing the behavior of redirect URI matching on the server probably constitutes a normative change to the spec. So I'm not sure that that's no protocol changes.
That one could likely be described in a best practices as opposed to a protocol level change. I know it's close, but there's a different implication on implementers.
Torsten, I see it the same way, and from my perspective, recommending exact exact redirect URI matching is something we should have done just before. So let's do it now. Then this is a prerequisite fulfilled. Cool.
Not Sakimura and RI. Making more restrictive is just creating a profile, not the normative change the spec itself. So it should be just fine.
Mike over there. Okay.
Not on these slides also, I think, is the thing that the researchers in Trier had originally recommended, which was having per authorization server redirect URIs at the client.
That's included in here.
Well, they're different things. One is whether the server does exact matching. And the other is whether the client is free to use a single redirect URI with multiple authorization servers, or whether it needs to use different ones.
Should I add that one as well?
Well, it's essentially the same one. The exact redirect URI matching is a prerequisite to having the client unique redirect URI make any sense.
Right.
So
yeah, so
one
it's
without
sort of
the
included.
other is not useful.
So maybe I should say plus per AS URI.
Yeah, so it's
the mitigation is per AS redirect URIs, and a precondition of that working is exact redirect URI matching on the server.
John, you don't have mic.
I know, I can talk loud.
So this is not Sakimura again. It was about exact redirect URI matching on the server, and that URI had to be per AS redirect URI, and that redirect URI had to be saved in session and compared, so that it's not going. It wasn't. You can check that it wasn't tainted.
So it should.
If you don't check the session, it's an even bigger security hole.
Or it's just an injection thing.
But I would still say, like, from an we're talking about in this specific case here about do we change the OAuth protocol? I would say we are not introducing new parameters here. I would say it's profiling, constraining the
William Dennis, I agree with Nat and Torsten and Brian on this. It is the best practice is just restricting. It's saying that we have a set of practices, which is Oauth 2, and we have a best practice, which is exact matching and using unique URIs. And I want to point out too that some people are already doing exact matching, which is a requirement for Connect. We are, for example. So any client that wants to get protected today can do it today. Also at Trier, one of the researchers noticed that of the 33 apps that they investigated, 100% of them were actually using per AS redirects. So actually those clients and the server they were using was completely already protected against mix-up.
I don't want to get too far in the weeds, Mike Jones, but I'll point out that that was a completely biased data set because he was only looking at things that did hand registration. He wasn't looking at anything that did dynamic registration. So of course they were going to be different. I'm not saying that that's not a good thing. I'm saying that doesn't say that the industry is doing that in all cases.
All right, well, let me just state clearly my position and that of my team, because I have talked extensively with them about this, that they were unconvinced that this was a big problem, and I felt that it can be solved with the per app redirect, which doesn't require a protocol change. So that's our position. We're probably not going to implement this. At least that's the feedback I have from the engineers.
That's right.
Tony Nadlin, this has been going on since December, and I don't think there is still a clear set of issues that all these 10 or 15 or wherever how many are these drafts that are floating around. And so you still don't have a complete list of all the things you're trying to solve, all the issues,
So
with a clear description of the issues, and where these particular, the threats haven't been fully defined, and either these mitigations don't tell you what threats they're trying to solve either. They're just drafts that are out there.
I disagree with you, Tony. I think
that's fine.
So we talk about one specific topic only.
Not here. This has been.
This is now. Well, there has been a lot of discussions, and that's good. We need discussions and so on. We're trying to find out what the mix-up attack that was identified in the end of last year by the researcher. I distributed the paper, how that was, how we deal with that. And we have other security issues where we also have documents about them, but at the moment, we try to solve that specific one, not others. Is that okay?
Well,
because otherwise, it gets very complicated if we.
Some of the stuff that you already have up there is, not quite solving or not quite part of the mitigations. I mean, the configuration changes.
But that's my sort of I used Andre's categorization and tried to sort of create that slide and based on what I think. So I think this specific category of mitigation is a configuration change at the provider and the client. Is that fair to say?
Let me please respond to what Hannes and Tony said. So I think that scheme makes a lot of sense, and I think can help us to discuss a lot of those attacks and the mitigations and what their pros and cons are. But I totally agree with Tony. This is just one threat, right? Yeah. So, and even the mix-up document covers 2 of them. And I repeat, there's also the injection, and we didn't discuss injection yet. And from my perspective, this is much more severe. We didn't discuss XSRF. We didn't discuss open redirectors on both client and server side, and there are a lot of other things. My question is, when will we discuss those things? And I think the idea on the table yesterday was to have a document which document all those different threats that we've learned from our practical experience with deployments are important. I mean, even though those attacks are not that highly sophisticated as the mix-up attack, I think they are very relevant from a practical perspective. So the question is, when will we start to work on those topics?
So I think those are different questions because it's and we said it's good to write those and we have the threats document. We advanced the threat document to one that covers also those more recent attacks, transform it into a PCP. But this is about deciding within the group on this specific attack. What is the story? What do we need to present to the community when they say there's this attack? What I'm supposed to do? I'm not supposed to, in the end, like have, oh, you could do this, execute this. We need to sort of recommend one specific solution. At least that's my hope. We've been talking about it for almost for half a year. Why at what point in time should we make that decision? I want to hear what the group thinks that they are leaning for on that specific issue.
Yeah, I actually wanted to queue up Andre to say one thing here that he said in Trier, which I thought was incredibly valuable. He presented a taxonomy of the way that attacks arise. I mean, part of his background before Facebook is he used to break OAuth implementations with great regularity. And so he's thought a lot about how these things arise. So you talked about containment and one other principle. Can you briefly do that?
Yeah, thanks for bringing this. So I defined that there are 2 missing security properties, and we can actually try to explain all of the attacks. I'm not going to do this today because there are too many of them, but most of them fall in 2 categories. So the authentication failure and the containment failure. So by authentication failure, I mean that the so-called double redirection protocols are like OAuth, OpenID Connect. They don't have a good way to figure out what for the endpoints. There are no good ways to figure out who called it, and so all of the attacks are happening due to the authorization endpoint being incapable of figuring out which client calls it, and the same for the redirection endpoint. It is unable to figure out who calls it, which identity provider. And there is a second property, which is containment. Basically, whenever something is leaked, code, access token, or any other credentials, they are leaked through known info leaks, and we would like to systematically strengthen the security of the client-side redirection flows. That was the idea, if I got your question right.
Did you capture that?
Well, this is written up in the slide that you presented at the workshop last week. So the question to me is, we don't have too much time. We just need to switch to another presentation already. So here's what I hear. I hear certain different solution approaches for dealing with the mix-up attack, and I hear different preferences on what people would like to do with those, and we need to make a decision on those. But I also hear that some other people say they don't want to talk about specific attacks, but instead want to talk about all of them at the same time, and then talk about document those, which I think are two orthogonal issues, but
So as one of the authors of the mix-up attack, my observation of the process over nearly a year, well, at least, what is it, 9 months?
Mm-hmm.
That's a long time. My puppy is now this tall.
Say what you want to say.
We cannot, the working group is not in the mood to agree on normative changes to OAuth within a reasonable amount of time that will actually protect end users. So the only sort of viable thing I can see going forward in the short term is to provide non-normative guidance, best practices around exact redirect URIs, all of the things. It's going to be a bunch of best practices that clients are going to have to rewrite themselves with. It's not a trivial amount of work to use the best practices to protect yourselves from where most of them are, but explain to them how to protect themselves against cross-site request forgery and how to properly check, use some sort of in-browser state to check the redirect URI that matches the actual URI it comes back on. So there's a whole bunch of things that people can do, but we can get started on that now. There's no downside in people protecting themselves, and work on these longer term things of identifying all of the various threats and come up with a longer term strategy for a set of normative changes that we can all agree on, because none of the vendors are going to die a death of 1,000 cuts. Tony and Google and various people are going to update their servers once, and that's it. We can't put our customers through endless micro changes. Just not going to happen. So we have to get our act together. We can provide non-normative stuff now. I know Brian wants to keep revving changes in our server. That's why he's got his head between his knees. But I think that's the only viable way forward.
I totally agree with you, Thorsten speaking. So that's why I think doesn't really make that much sense to have isolated discussions regarding different threats. So we can have a discussion about mix-up. We can make a decision what's from our perspective the best solution, and then we go to the next threat, and then we realize, oh fuck, if we had decided for another mitigation, then we potentially would have also solved the other threat.
No,
I mean, this is
no.
what happens in real life.
No, this is not.
This is what
actually exactly not the issue here.
This is exactly the issue.
No,
this exact redirect UI matching will solve us a lot of problems. But we didn't talk about that.
Have you just listened to what John said? He essentially what he said is we have these 3 mitigations, but because people don't want to make any changes, this is the only mechanism that they are going to use.
This is John's opinion.
And what's your opinion?
My opinion is we should have a discussion on the obvious threat that are on the table, which are XSRF, injection, section fixation, open redirectors. Have I missed something? No. Okay. So we should have a discussion on that, and we should decide which are the mitigation that solve those problems, documented in one BCP, period, full stop. This is what the community needs. And if we can come up with non-normative changes, just recommendations. I would be fine with that if that's possible. But I do not know yet because we didn't have that discussion.
We had lots of those discussions. I remember
when
we had discussions in December. We had discussions on a mailing list
about mix-up. Nothing else.
No, we had discussions on all these other topics as well. And
okay, point me to the discussion about XSRF.
And some people said that they are going to write this up, and I've not seen anything on that happening. And then other people complain that it takes so long. William
Dennis, I think the path that John just proposed makes sense to me. Let's gather all these best practices and then try and, if we are going to make a normative change, then try and do it once and solve the fundamental problems. And I want to point out that this is not just about mix-up. In fact, if you implement the exact redirect UI matching, you close a whole bunch. I think you alluded to that, but I just want to draw people's attention to this because you actually close a whole category of attacks that, frankly, are probably more scary than mix-up, because mix-up actually assumes you have a compromised or a bad OP, but an open redirector that can be used with a good OP, right? So
right, and we have that we can definitely point to the open redirector. There's a separate write-up on this, and we have.
I think that the Oauth working group having a BCP that is continually updated makes a
which
whole
is
lot of
perfectly
sense.
fine, but it still needs to. When you talk about the high-level document, as you say, a PCP, everyone wants to have a PCP on recommendations. But what I want to have a discussion on is that on the different topics that go into the PCP, and whatever topic I start with, people say, oh, there's this other attack that is more important. I don't want to talk about this. And as soon as we start with something else, they want to talk. Nobody, when I send out the agenda for the meeting, nobody sent me a message and said, this is an attack that I don't care about. I want to discuss a different attack. Did I see such a message on the list? No, I didn't.
I agree with your point that the working group should have an opinion on the correct way to mitigate that attack, as it is an individual thing. And I mean,
Right.
I think my thoughts are on the record, so I don't know if you want to poll people or something, but
Yeah, what I hear is people. That's what people want to do in that specific case. That's the best current practice on this specific topic. That's what I haven't heard anyone saying anything else.
so maybe we should start that draft and see if it holds up, or reword the current one.
I say it again. The draft addresses 2 different threats, and we haven't discussed the code injection yet.
Yeah. Okay. So I didn't mean to imply that nobody is willing to make any changes. It's a risk-benefit analysis. I don't think so. All of the conversations I've had with the various implementers, everybody has said, we don't believe that the risk for this attack is sufficient to warrant this individual breaking protocol change, which people may or may not implement. So I get the sense that people want to recommend what we can do now without making normative changes and take a more holistic view of what is a basket of changes that will address all of our known issues after we enumerate what those issues are, and use the tools that we have at hand so that we actually have a chance of doing a significant amount of changes to as one go to address all of the outstanding issues at one time rather than doing, I think the fear that Tony and various other people have expressed is you do this week, we have another, still haven't addressed the code injection attack. That's another, or re-injection attack. That's another fix that we'll do in 6 months. And then we have another one that we're going to do in another 6 months. And that doesn't meet people's view of a good life.
And Andre was next.
Just answering the question regarding the code injection, from my perspective of maybe 4 years or breaking in practice the OAuth implementation, I don't quite understand what is the attack code injection. So it means just reusing the stolen code. It's not important. So for example, exact redirectory URI matching is an important thing. Is if we are trying to move to this, at least I would understand, even if Facebook doesn't have it yet.
The code injection attack is one that's been used against Facebook successfully several times in the past. So we can go over the details of it, but essentially it's a way of, for identity, so it either allows you to, an attacker to get a hold of the user's account and bind the user's resources to a new account, or impersonate that user at a particular relying party when that relying party is mistakenly using OAuth on its own for identity purposes. So there are real attacks there that have been exploited in the past.
I just have a comment from Justin Richer in the chat. He agrees with John that we should do a BCP now, noting that it can be updated later, and then collect the normative changes and go off and write OAuth 3.
Quite say OAuth 3, but I implied it.
Okay.
We'll pick a number later.
Okay. So while I think about the next steps, we jump over to the next topic, token binding.
Does our area director have any recommendations?
Well, we'll maybe have to talk offline to figure out what the best way forward is. It's complicated.
It is complicated.
Yeah. Okay, which slide deck do you want to start with?
Token binding right there.
Is that okay? Kathleen, should we have a sort of discussion afterwards and then?
Let's do that, and I'm going to apologize. I'm going to step out shortly.
No, that's okay. We can talk about this.
It's just the timing,
Not ideal.
Not
Points for not
presentation.
running out screaming by this one.
My hair on fire.
My God, what have they been doing?
All the scary thing.
It's only because you understand what's going on.
I only get scared by the people.
So this is Mike Jones again. The OAuth token binding is something we've talked about for a while. The IETF token binding working group is nearly done with some documents, and OAuth and the OpenID community both wanted to look at how we would use token binding as specified before they actually call it done. Next. So we wanted to provide exact syntax and semantics on, or to propose exact syntax on semantics on how to use token binding with OAuth access tokens, OAuth refresh tokens, and OpenID Connect ID tokens. And in the last slide, we'll say a whole bunch more places where you might use it, but this will do for the current discussion. And I should say that I did present this same deck, and Brian presented the same deck that he'll present in a moment to the token binding working group. We're going to emphasize different things in the different places, but the content was sort of fully relevant to both. And the main thing is you want to do end-to-end testing and identify any gaps in a spec before it's actually called done. So next. Refresh tokens are easy to token bind. The reason it's easy is because there's only two parties and they're only using one channel. So it's just like token binding a cookie. And in fact, the authorization server can put the token binding info either in the refresh token or in a data structure about the refresh token. It's a private implementation choice. The client doesn't even have to know this is happening, and these refresh tokens can be checked by the authorization server, and life is just, slightly better. Next. There is a draft in the token binding working group on how to do federation in browser contexts with token binding, which Dirk, among others, has worked on. That's very applicable to federation use cases like OpenID Connect, SAML, etc. In this case, there's three parties using two connections. A user agent or browser talking with the relying party and the identity provider. And you do a 302 redirect between the two. Magic happens in the HTTPS token binding spec, where the token binding ID for the relying party channel can get sent to the identity provider as what's called a referred token binding. The IDP can put the referred token binding in the token, gets sent to the relying party can validate the token binding because it's on its own channel and do the equality check for the token binding information. This all just works as well. And there's a draft about that that's referenced from the Oauth draft. Next. As an aside, we made an implementation choice, which I talked about with Andrei Popov and Dirk and some others, which is rather than sending the full token binding ID, which is a representation of a public key plus a type prefix, which at least in the RSA case is reasonably big, bigger than you want to put in an ID token. Instead, we're just sending the SHA-256 hash of that value, which is good enough for comparison purposes. And we think we know how to enable crypto agility for the hash function. A future draft will do that, but this is straightforward stuff. Turns out access tokens were more interesting, in part because OAuth is more interesting. As you know, and you may not have thought about it for a while, in OAuth, there's three parties using two, or depending upon which flow you're using, sometimes three connections. There's the client to the resource server, the client's user agent to the authorization server, the client and the authorization server token endpoint. And Brian Campbell can talk if he wants about why the client, in fact, may be broken into multiple pieces on different hosts. And just OAuth is more complicated than straight federation. You can still do this in a similar pattern. You want the client to learn the token binding for the resource server, which is the ultimate target of the access token. And you really then want that to be communicated to the authorization server so it can put that token binding ID in the access token or associate it with the access token so that the resource server can check it. And so it's a lot like the federation use case, but the actual mechanics are where it's a little different. Next. So the good news about having done these drafts now is we did identify a potential gap in the core token binding protocol spec. Not in the ways that people have actually probably implemented it, but in terms of the functionality you want to require, or at least recommend in some use cases. The trick, or the problem that makes this different than the browser 302 case, is that the token binding protocol spec doesn't provide necessarily a way for a native application, which might be your OAuth client, that's communicating on two different TLS channels, to send its token binding info from one the one to the resource, to the other, which is the one to the authorization server, as the referred token binding in the same way that the 302 does in the HTTPS token binding draft. And so this occupied most of the time yesterday in the token binding discussion during my session, as probably it should have, because people were getting educated on the situation. And let's see, Jeff Hodges is in the room. Where the token binding working group landed on this is that we would take a crack, Jeff and I and whoever else wants to help, at doing two things. One is writing up implementation API guidance somewhere along the lines of, if you support a referred token binding ID, you should provide applications a security appropriate way to send the referred token binding ID. And Tony's getting up, but I think I'll address what you're going to say anyway. This is not trying to put specific requirements on APIs. This is saying that if you export functionality, this is needed for some of these use cases.
Mine was for clarification on.
Microphone.
Mine was for Tony Nadlin. Mine was for clarification on where the sentences go. I assume the sentences go here and nothing to do with the token binding documents.
That's not my sense of what the token binding working group asked for. We've got one of the chairs here. In fact, I think we have both of the chairs here. That I was going to write it in a general way with Jeff. The other thing that came from Stephen Farrell, our area director in token binding, was a request that the privacy implications of using the referred token binding also be described at the same time, which is entirely reasonable. I don't know, John, do you want to answer Tony's question? Is Leif still here?
Yeah. John Bradley. I believe the goal was to have a couple of Weasley sentences added to the HTTP token binding spec to the effect that if the platform is providing referred token binding to applications, it should provide an API for those applications to use it.
Yeah, and the privacy and security considerations to match, right? Because the more leeway you give yourselves in the API, the more you can sort of screw around with users. So absolutely, all subject to working group consensus, right?
But I think the consensus that I got from the room was that it was in no way to be interpreted as forcing an application to provide referred token binding.
No, I believe it was talked about as guidance, not prescriptive. I heard no consensus or drive for prescriptive language, although people were worried about the privacy implications.
And coming back sort of to the OAuth side of it, rather than the token binding working group side of it, the reason this matters to OAuth, I think, is that the natural way to do token binding for access tokens is to be able to use a referred token binding. If we believe that the implementations that OAuth runs on are going to be able to do that, which I know that Windows 10 can, I'm talking to some others, I think some of the Google ones can, I can't speak for others. Then it's reasonable for us in the OAuth working group to say the syntax you use to achieve access token binding is a referred token binding from the resource channel and put that into or associate it with the access token. If we don't believe we're going to have that functionality, we're going to have to do something less natural and that doesn't provide the same end-to-end cryptographic guarantees.
William Dennis, I just want to add my voice to support that approach. I think given that the referred token binding has as a way to semantically represent this, then preferably we should use it. And if you're saying if Microsoft and Google have already implemented it or will implement it in that way, I don't know if there are any other implementations that we're tracking, but they're not
there yet.
right. So we're probably in a good place. I think maybe we can start with that.
Descartes. There's a use case you're not covered yet, which is that the client maybe broke across multiple machines, and so you may need more than one access token. And so you may have the client calling from both a desktop machine and a server machine, depending on what's going on. Having written clients like that myself, so I think you need to think about how to address that as well.
Yeah, I was just going to point out that there are clustered client use cases and split client use cases that the referred token binding won't work for. So we need to consider those options and document what this won't do if we're going to make that decision.
Another question, is there a particular reason why you didn't describe how to token bind authorization codes? No. Brian's draft won't describe that. What I'm talking about is binding the authorization code to the TLS connection on the front channel. Dirk has some text in his document he distributed today about
that. The answer is we're not as smart as Dirk. Brian pulls my IQ down. Dirk, we're mostly focusing on native apps where that doesn't actually work. At least not without some reworking of the browsers. So we're probably going to have some conversations with browser vendors and to see whether or not we can make some sense of that with native apps. But certainly on the where the client is a web server, then that token binding would certainly make sense. So that's something that we have to add to one or more of the drafts. Now, there's also some discussion that we've had around token binding the client ID, which may, I know Brian is shaking his head, but other people are.
I personally think it would be very valuable to have a mechanism to bind the code to the TLS connection between the user agent and the backend of the web application, because we just mentioned the code injection. So I just wanted to know whether there is any particular technical reason or whatever why I didn't add it.
No, there wasn't any philosophical objection. If you use token binding for client credentials, then you wouldn't need the Pixie method, but you would still need that. So we have to look at, as we actually develop this, then we have to figure out, probably take an assessment about which pieces actually make sense and how the document ultimately will be structured. But if we don't start, we're never going to finish.
Tony Nadlin, I think this is a very poor way to proceed as far as putting any stuff into the token binding documents, because we're going to have all sorts of different types of tokens coming around, and if people want to bind them, it may require other changes and stuff, and we really don't want to go back and rev the token binding specs. They're pretty accurate as they exist, and putting the statements in there doesn't make sense. The relation I asked where the statement about access tokens is going to go. And it's going to go into the token binding spec.
He's still in the previous.
I'm still on the previous.
He hasn't caught up. He'll object to the
No, I'll object later. I'll object after the meeting, but no.
He's still fighting with Mike.
William, that is, I guess I see it slightly differently. I don't see it as access token. I just see it as referred token binding.
But there's going to be Tony Nadlin, but there's going to be all sorts of different tokens. You can do referred tokens with ID tokens and other tokens without any changes, without anything. Now we've got a special case of an access token. We're going to have a special case of another token. You don't know. Yes, it is. It's an access token that's causing the problems. It's access token and potentially even token exchange tokens.
Here we go.
Dirk Ravens. I'm pretty sure that the language that Mike and Jeff will draft, that the group will agree on, will not use the words OAuth in it or access token or anything like that.
Gee, Dirk, that's what I got up to say.
Justin says, Tony, yes, that's the point of having a general function mechanism. I'm glad to see you're on board now.
Next slide.
Yeah.
We've kind of covered this, but the point is to enable general functionality of the referred token binding. Actually, we had that discussion in the token binding working group, so we'll save time. Sort of to Torsten's question, well, why didn't you do some other things? I'll generalize your question. The truth is, you know, rather quickly before the submission deadline, a few of us wanted to write something down to get this conversation started. There's a number of other places where token binding could make sense, such as token bound JOTs for client authentication, token bound JOTs for authorization grants, some of the token exchange flows. John even has a science project in his head, which I think is valid, which is a token bound client ID, where the client ID is, you know, bound to the right channels. And, you know, Brian's going to talk about another one in a minute. So there's a lot of good work. Procedurally, do you want to talk about document adoption and structuring after Brian goes? Because I think we should adopt something or some things as working group documents to try to move this forward.
Yeah, we actually, unfortunately, running out of time. We have 9 minutes left, so so we won't have time for your presentation. I think.
Read Brian's draft. It's a good draft.
So I think.
2 minutes somewhere. So
Yes, give it a summary. 2 minutes. And use the microphone. Sorry, Brian.
The 2 minute, maybe less summary is a token binding method for Pixie, which does bind the authorization code, but it binds it to the client the same way as Pixie. And quite frankly, the document that Dirk sent out this morning examines that and a lot of this stuff, token binding for OAuth, in a much more nuanced and thought through way. And I think there's value in what I wrote in the native app case. There's also value for the other mechanisms that Dirk had in the web server case. And I also think there's aspects of what's in that document that should probably make its way into whatever the generalized token binding document is. And furthermore, I think probably the document that I wrote should be, with some new stuff, should be folded into sort of one grand token binding for OAuth doc. Somebody will come up with a better name than that, but that's my 2 minute summary. No.
Okay, thank you, Brian.
Because it layers on top of existing OAuth with non-breaking changes, so it's not a 3.
William, you want to say something about that?
Dennis William.
Yes, that is me. Yeah, I want to suggest that we do try and have one document. I think one thing that we learned from TRIO last week is that it's good to clearly state what the objectives are at the top of the document. And then you can actually test to see if those objectives have been solved. And so I think, like when we've been looking at it, Dirk, it's kind of like the objective is, you know, with the following potential man in the middles in various different bits, can we completely secure the entire OAuth flow? And that was sort of our objective. Whereas I think if we just token bind every little bit separately, there's not necessarily a guarantee that it all plugs together correctly. So I think all the work that I've seen has been great. I think let's try and get into one doc that has that end-to-end objective has, and then, you know, with things like the protecting the redirect channel as well.
Particularly in the OAuth cases, there's a lot of other things it solves beyond man-in-the-middle protection, though, like all kinds of token leakage and reuse and replay that, at least in my world, are much more likely in the threat model. So I agree with you, but I don't want to lose track of those things because I think there's a ton of value even when you don't assume sort of like a super powered SSL intercepting intermediary.
Since this is Dirk, since we're running out of time, I checked the schedule. I don't think there's any other sessions afterwards. I'm happy to stay here and talk people through the doc that I sent out this morning, because I know I hate reading what other people send. Which I'm sure is going to be much more interesting than this, so I rescind my offer. Well, I'm going to stay behind anyway.
Okay.
So Hannes, can I ask that the 2 token binding documents and perhaps be adopted as working group documents, and that we also take the document that Dirk has sent to the list as further information, and that they perhaps be reworked as a single OAuth token binding document?
Yeah, I think the question is whether the group wants to pick up the token binding work in general, regardless on what this exact document structuring is, which we'll have to figure out later. So I will start with that one and can then come back to the other proof of possession work that we've been doing, trying to figure out how those pieces fit in there and which ones of those activities we want to continue. So let me start with the token binding stuff. So you've heard at least maybe already from the token binding working group the presentations, and now here sort of a repeat. So who's in favor of moving forward with this token binding work in the OAuth working group as a proof of possession mechanism? Raise your hand. That's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, maybe it's 13. Who's against that? 13, yeah, roughly. Who's against? Nobody. So that's pretty good. At the moment, we have a few documents on this proof of possession. One is the architecture, which is sort of like laying out use cases on why we are actually doing that in comparison to the browser tokens. It talks about threats and so on. That's a very generic document. It's an informational document. It needs to cover sort of like the different, what previously we said that we are going to update the use cases, because initially when we worked in a group, we've focused on something else. The second, then there were 2 other documents. One is that talks about the key distribution, because we not only had a functionality for asymmetric cryptography, which is what the token binding does, but also for symmetric keys. This is something that we utilize in the ACE working group. And so the question there is, do we want to proceed with the symmetric key mechanism here in this working group, or want to just move it over to ACE? That's sort of, because clearly the token binding itself provides the asymmetric mechanisms in there. So any views on that?
Mike Jones, Microsoft. I know that there's a bunch of Microsoft use cases, even though we have token binding, where they want to do application level token binding for OAuth. So they would want me to continue that work. To your second question about whether to move it to ACE, that would scare me, because many of the ACE people are only focused on IoT use cases and symmetric keys. And there's a bigger world of, enabled devices rather than constrained devices that we want to design for the whole spectrum. And I think OAuth has done a good job at that. I will give an aside that there is an OAuth profile for ACE document over in ACE land that I suggest a bunch of you read, because it's pretty different than OAuth actually. And yet it's their interpretation of OAuth. I think the industry would be well served to have things be more similar than they will come out if we don't participate.
That's a separate step. So that's one perspective. So who's in John? Keep it short.
I think that there are still use cases for signed messages and mutual TLS and that, but I'm hesitant to sort of lump them all together because token binding is actually
no, it's not lumped together.
Well,
They're separate. It's
right. So I think that we should keep both of them, but I don't think that we should necessarily conflate them in the documents. People should have a clean read of what we're doing with token binding and not be scared off by all of the additional key agreement and stuff that we're adding.
We don't do that. Well, that specific document that I'm talking about is the key transport. You actually co-authored.
Yeah, I know, but it even scares me in some of its complexity. So, so I think that we still need to have it for some of the advanced use cases, but I don't want to complicate the simple token binding use cases by forcing everyone to read that. So I think we still need to do both, but I don't think that
you don't have to read. If you do the token binding, you don't have to read that document.
Well, it depends on how we reorganize these documents, as you said. So in that reorganization, I would like to keep
I'm not
keep the
planning
two parts of token binding, the sort of consumer happy path stuff, and if you're the CIA, how you actually do mutual TLS and distribute the So I think that there are separate use cases for the two documents, and I don't want to necessarily force everyone to have to read both of them.
So here a little bit structuring. Then the last item, which I think is probably the most difficult one, is the question which was initially motivated by some of the use cases was to the HTTP signing, which of course token binding provides a different solution at the TLS layer. So the question is, how do we proceed with that one, the HTTP signing mechanism?
HTTP signing is hard, and I think Justin is doing an excellent job.
That your smile in the face makes me worry a little. That looks weird.
I would like it to be his problem, which he's now going to take revenge on me for. I think that there are end-to-end application level things where it's useful, but it's a horrible. It has all the horrible baggage of OAuth 1 done in JOT, and there's almost nothing that is going to make that a bulletproof solution in all circumstances. So it's a really hard thing, which is why not everyone is saying, "Oh golly, I want to do that." I think some people will need it, but it's always going to be ugly.
This is Brian. It is really, really hard, and that's one of the reasons it's been sort of sitting without progress in this working group for, I don't know, something measured in years. John may be right that there may be some use cases for it, but I would tend to prefer see us focus on working towards a token binding profile that's likely to actually get implemented and add security and solve real cases, and either discontinue the key distribution and HTTP signing or let them continue to be on hold. But I think we'd be better served by having less options and one specific set of token binding profiles that actually does something rather than all these different variations.
Justin says, 1, shut up, John. 2, message level signatures are a necessary thing, and yes, it's a mess. We could alternatively publish HTTP signing as is.
I've been told to shut up. So.
Yeah, Tony Nadlin, I would not agree with publishing that document. I mean, who's actually going to implement it? Maybe Justin, and that's it. Take a poll of who's going to implement it.
Yeah, let me ask on who would like to keep the document in a group and move forward with the HTTP signing, and who sort of thinks that we should refocus our effort on one solution. Say again.
Did you close out on the symmetric question before you got here?
No, no,
Or
no.
Closing both things.
No, no. It has, those are orthogonal to each other. The symmetric stuff is used in ACE, so the question is not whether we close it, it's just a question of
No,
where
no,
to do.
we didn't close out the discussion here on whether to stay here or move to
Right.
ACE on that.
Like-
And now you're moving on. I don't want these things to get bound up.
Right.
I want separation between the two.
Yeah,
And-
they are
and
they are
closure.
orthogonal. Yeah. So let me ask the question on the HTTP signing. Or is this does Justin have something on that specific issue? Phil has on it. Okay. Is that
That's
Ludwig?
on the previous one, symmetric keys.
Okay.
This is message from ACE. We need proof of possession, both for symmetric and for asymmetric keys. And if you don't do it, we will do it. So please do it. We prefer if you do it.
Okay.
Phil says we may need to go to content-specific signing, e.g. signed HTTP JSON requests responses. The spec would profile HTTP and describe JSON body as well as header restrictions.
Okay. So let me ask the two questions. Let me start with the HTTP signing. So who raise your hand if you prefer the HTTP signing to be continued in this group? Raise your hand. Okay. Nobody so far. There's some. Okay, Justin. And Justin. Okay. And who prefers it to be sort of abandoned? We changed our mind.
You mean abandoned as stop?
Stop.
Or just
No, just we.
take it out of our charter. Is that what you mean?
That would mean we sort of remove the milestone. Not just putting on hold, but we
Okay.
can. Yes.
Okay,
We don't work on it.
Because Brian suggested either putting on hold or abandoning it. I just want to make sure that
Yeah.
we're not
We would.
conflating the two.
We would remove the milestone.
Thorsten, might be a stupid question, but if you do not continue to work on the HTTP signing, what value does the key distribution have? And ACE is going to specify their own signing mechanism, or?
Yeah, it has.
What do you use today?
No, it's they are not using HTTP. It's using co-op.
So there is a need for some signing mechanism.
But it's already being worked on. It's called OSCOOP.
In ACE.
In
But
ACE.
we're not talking about OAuth. So if we drop HTTP signing, we need something different. Otherwise, the key distribution is not really useful.
But ACE can use the.
Yeah.
No,
What I would like to know, if we have key distribution, then we also need some signing. Otherwise, we
No,
do
no,
the
the
key
key-
distribution and other people do the signing.
No, it's you can actually use the key distribution also. You can dump it straight into TLS if you want. But the solution that the ACE working group is entertaining is there are actually different ideas. One is on the application layer with OSCOOP, and the other one is to dump it straight into TLS with a shared secret.
Lucy Lynch, can I ask for 2 sets of hums?
Sure, sure.
So can we get a hum on whether or not to do the symmetric stuff here or to move it to ACE and get clarity on that? And then can we hum on whether or not to put on hold or to abandon, as opposed to say, who would implement this, let's abandon? Because the original request was to put on hold. And I believe you're right, that if you're going to proceed with this, putting it on hold until you know what you're doing with the symmetric signing stuff is important. So,
But the on hold comment, I think it was referring to the HTTP signing, was it?
right, I'm making a process objection here because I think you jumped. You asked for a show of hands on who would implement, and then you jumped to abandon. I would like more options on the table and an understanding from the group about that.
So okay. So who is so I finished the HTTP signing. So who would be in favor of putting it on hold instead of abandoning it? Raise your hand. The HTTP signing. 1, 2 hands, 3 hands. Okay. Well, okay. So now you decide. Raise your hand when I said raise your hand, not some random other button. So if you think it's we should put we should put HTTP signing on hold rather than removing it from the charter? Please raise your hand now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 persons. Okay.
One online.
So now I go back to the symmetric stuff. But the abandoned question, and I did ask already beforehand.
No, you did. We stopped before you asked.
Okay. No. Yeah. No, I would like to get that clarity on that. So who is in favor of abandoning the HTTP signing stuff? 1, 2, 3. Okay. Symmetric key. Who is in favor of moving that to the move that to the
When you say symmetric key, you mean symmetric key distribution.
symmetric key distribution? The symmetric key distribution mechanism. Who is in favor of moving it to the ACE working group? Who's in favor of keeping it in the ACE in the Oauth working group? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, 7. Who is in favor of abandoning it? 1, 2, 3. Okay. Because you don't care about the ACE use cases. Good. Okay. But that's then a different question. And abandoning it, so you're abandoning it here, and then letting, which is the same as moving it to ACE. But okay, good. That's okay. That's okay. Good. I think we went through all the questions that I could have possibly asked you guys. We did that already.
How did that go?
Oh my God, it went well. Do you have some
There's
questions?
Some comments on.
Okay.
Okay. So Phil says the problem is that without signing, a lot of the current POP drafts have limited value. Wouldn't that leave us with only token binding for POP? And Justin said.
No, we just talked about that. Talked that through.
And Justin says, I've always thought there would be different presentation mechanisms. HTTP signing would be one.
We're well over time. Yes.
Yeah. So, well, then, so we officially done. But there may be different. So it seems that initially we had some ideas for different presentation mechanisms, but the appetite for that seems to have vanished in the group, at least for most people.
Are we done? Yes, we're
Done. Bye, guys. Good. Oh, the blue sheet. Give me the blue sheet. Okay. Did you guys sign the blue sheet?
Anyone wants to stay behind and talk about this documenting? If not, we can all go to the camera. Okay.